Hello, I'm Sarah Helton of Michael Best Strategies, Washington, D.C. office, and a Wisconsinite as well. I'm pleased to welcome you to this event, part of the Trade Policy Initiative organized by WisBusiness.com and the Wisconsin Technology Council. Michael Best Strategies is the sponsor of this initiative in its second year. The initiative aims to provide context to the nitty-gritty of trade. We're sponsors of this initiative because it provides an important and valuable forum to discuss the various impacts of trade on Wisconsin's as well as our nation's economy. Our dedicated team of trade experts have had the great opportunity to work with a number of Wisconsin companies and help them successfully navigate through trade issues. And in addition to 4 trade policy events per year, the Trade Policy Initiative spurs more discussion on Midwest trade through the video podcast, Talking Trade. You can find these discussions at wisbusiness.com. Go to Trade Policy and then horizontal navigation bar. There you'll find informal 10-minute discussions between host Ian Coxhead and Sandy Siegel and a guest expert on Midwest trade. Other partners of this effort include MMAC's World Trade Association, the Madison International Trade Association, the Wisconsin District Export Council, the International Practice Section of the State Bar of Wisconsin, and UW Center of East Asian Studies. Today, we're focusing on a conflict that's affecting world trade, commodity prices, energy supplies, and the economy. It's called The War Hits Home: How the Ukraine Conflict Affects Trade in Europe, the United States, and in Wisconsin. And we have brought together a group of Wisconsinites who know Russia and the issue like few others. Tom Barrett, the ambassador to Luxembourg, plus 3 former ambassadors. Mark Green, the former ambassador to Tanzania and the USAID administrator, who now heads the Wilson Center in DC. Rick Graber, the former ambassador to the Czech Republic, who now heads the Bradley Foundation in Milwaukee. And Tom Loftus, who was the U.S. envoy to Norway. He is a former Assembly Speaker and UW Regent. The moderator for today's timely discussion is Tom Still, the president of Wisconsin Technology Council. So thank you for joining our program, and thanks to Tom for moderating. Now over to you, Tom.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Thanks to all of our audience members for joining in, and to the team at WisPolitics and WisBusiness for helping to put this together. Again, I'm Tom Still from the Tech Council. And I actually want to start by telling you what this webinar is not about. You know, we're going to try to stick pretty closely to trade and the economy as it has been affected by what's going on in Ukraine. You know, for audience members who may want to put in some questions via chat, we don't want to spend a lot of time because it's too much of, it would be just too much to try to focus on other aspects of the war and what's going on. And in some cases, I think our speakers probably aren't necessarily prepared to comment on that. But I'm going to start with an opening question, really, about with the fighting now entering the second month, how much, in your estimation, has the war disrupted trade, supply chains, and the economy, and whether it's Europe, the United States, Wisconsin in particular, other parts of the world? And just, you know, give me an estimate on this heading in. Is a great deal? Somewhat or not much? I think I know where we'll wind up, but let's say what we have there. Ambassador Barrett, you're on the ground in Luxembourg. Let's start with you on that question.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you very much for including me with this distinguished group, gentlemen that I've known for decades and have had the pleasure of serving with in one capacity or another. So I want to thank you, Jeff. I want to thank everybody who's been involved in this. And I do think we have to start, though, by acknowledging what we have here. We have a premeditated, unprovoked, unjustified, brutal invasion led by President Putin of another sovereign nation. And this is something that is really, for many, many human beings, something they've experienced for the first time in their lives. Certainly here, a lot of younger Europeans have not experienced something like this. And what I hear here most often is that this is obviously created the greatest humanitarian crisis that we've seen in Europe essentially since the 1940s. So this is something that we have to recognize the brutality of it. But I agree with you that the focus here today is on trade. And I think right right now, without a doubt, the biggest loser in all of this has been Russia. I mean, because Russia is the country that has seen the biggest impact because of the unprecedented actions taken by the European Union in conjunction with the United States and our other partners to really use some economic tools to make Russia understand that this is way, way, way beyond anything that's acceptable in our world. And so in terms of the impact here in Europe, there's a lot of concern about energy prices. I would say that that is the biggest concern that I have seen thus far. I think the United States is, and I'll let obviously people who are there speak to it. I think that our economy remains so strong. And I think President Biden has put it in a place where it is strong, but without a doubt, I think energy is the biggest thing. Now, there are going to be some products where you're going to see some supply chain issues, particularly if it's coming from Ukraine or from Russia. But right now, I think there's still perhaps a guarded hope that the international community will be able to take some steps to mitigate some of the fuel issues here, some of the energy issues, but that remains to be seen.
All right. Thank you, Ambassador Barrett. We'll be back to you on a couple of follow-ups with that. Next to Rick Graber, former ambassador to the Czech Republic, now running the Bradley Foundation. Thank you for joining us. And, like others on this panel, you have a depth of experience in, whether it's national politics, state politics, and just being around in a world that you've followed so closely. Tell us, what's your assessment on the trade and economic side right now?
Right. And again, thanks for coming. I'd echo what Tom said and Tom Barrett, and certainly agree with him about the brutality of what we're watching unfold. Look, there's no question that this conflict, this war, has had an impact on trade, on the economy in the United States and Europe, and of course, Wisconsin. We're all affected by this. It's a global economy. I guess I differ a little bit with Tom Barrett. I would say the impact has been somewhat. I don't think it is the sole reason why we're seeing supply chain issues in the United States, why we're seeing inflation, why we're seeing high energy and food prices. It's a factor, hasn't helped, but we've also seen policies that have added to regulation, which makes it tougher to do business in the United States and Wisconsin now. We've seen policies which have truly discouraged the unleashing of American energy resources. That's had an impact on gasoline prices in particular. We've seen policies that have added a lot of money to the system, a lot of money to the economy, which in my view has caused an increased demand, as you would expect, but without a corresponding increase in supply. And that gives you inflation. And we've also seen some policies that have just discouraged participation in the workforce. While unemployment in the United States is very low, there's still a great number of people that have not rejoined the workforce in the United States. So we've got a lot of problems. There's no single reason for these issues, these supply chain issues, these inflation issues, these high energy and food price issues. I think it's a combination of things. I think it's a combination of policies, and I think it's certainly the impact of this war has not helped.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, thank you, Ambassador Graber. And now over to former Ambassador Green, who served in Tanzania and has been a part of other things around the world, but now is directing the Wilson Center, which I know has been following this closely from the releases and reports you've been putting out. So tell us about your assessment. Affecting trade and the economy a lot, somewhat, not much.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks to the audience as well as my colleagues and former colleagues. So a few thoughts. First off, I have to make it personal. When I led the International Republican Institute, which is a democracy organization, my very first project was to observe elections with Madeleine Albright in Ukraine. And so this is all very, very meaningful and poignant for me. So first off, it's important to understand that this is not a bilateral conflict. It has long ceased to be a bilateral conflict, even though I think it gets captured that way on TV each evening. When you have a record number of refugees and internally displaced people, well over 10 million, and the refugee side, 5 million going to a number of countries in Europe, when you have damaged economies throughout the region, and you have in Vladimir Putin someone who has threatened weapons of mass destruction and actually at one point took over a nuclear power plant, this is no longer a bilateral matter. This impacts everyone. The fallout. I think the fallout is in some ways more serious than people realize, and in other ways not as extensive as people fear. First off, we're seeing projected decreased growth, economic growth around the world. And those are the numbers coming out of the IMF and World Bank in their meetings here in DC this week. Secondly, I think we have to understand that this is an uneven impact. With respect to my friend Tom Barrett, sometimes we forget the projected reduction in economy in Russia and Putin is projected to be 7 to 10% this year, 7 to 10% contraction. Ukraine will contract 45%, 45% economic reduction. And some of the other immediate countries in the area are going to be similar. So we're going to see tremendous fallout, I think, in the region. But let me add something to it that we don't often think about. I spoke to a Tanzanian businessman yesterday who's one of the largest distributors of basically food products on the continent. He said what everyone's missing here is that Ukraine and Russia are the largest sources of fertilizer. And so he said in much of the developing world, the impact will be that farmers will go and plant without fertilizer, which means decreased yields, which means shortages, and which means inflation. And Ukraine is a principal source of wheat in many parts of the world. So I think these are going to be serious impacts. The other thing it does is exacerbate the critical mineral supply. We already know because of COVID and challenges back here that the president's plans for a transition to a green economy, which we all certainly support, the critical minerals necessary to make that are simply less available. When it comes to cobalt, 70% of the world's cobalt comes from Congo. Half the world's lithium comes from South America. And when you have the disruptions that we're seeing, that's going to increase costs, weaken supply chains, and create, I think, some economic slowdown. So I think there will be real impact. What we're hearing from the administration is that many of the sanctions that have been imposed are sanctions that are only now beginning to kick in. They're not light switches going on and off. And so I think the question can best be answered, quite frankly, in the next couple of months, because sadly, I think we all believe this conflict is likely to go on for some time.
Very good. Thank you, Ambassador Green. And we'll get back to some of those specifics that you mentioned that are both challenges and in maybe some cases opportunities, especially for farmers in this country. Last but not least, Ambassador Loftus. He served in Norway, and over time he's been continued involved in world affairs. When he joined, he was with the World Health Organization for a bit. So, Tom Loftus, thank you for joining.
Thank you, Tom and colleagues. I want to talk about trade specifically as it deals with natural gas and natural gas supplies to the European Union. Norway in 2021 supplied almost 25% of the gas demand of the European Union and Britain. Norway exports about 95% of its gas. This goes through a subsea pipelines, which go to Germany, Britain, France, and Belgium. Another pipe opens in Poland later. This is where I entered. I came to Norway in 1993, the end of the Cold War, the end of the Soviet Union, a time of optimism. But as my Finnish colleague told me, they're the same Russians, Tom. So you have Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, They had just come out of more than 50 years of first Nazi and then Soviet occupation. And what they were after and what the United States policy was to envelop those countries into Western institutions, specifically the EU and NATO. And in January 1st of 1995, Finland, Sweden, and Austria joined the European Union, first and foremost because of security, and security as a defense against Russia. Secondly, it was about trade. Norway can expand its natural gas exports a little bit by shifting some fields from oil production to natural gas, but it can't do very much. Algeria is the third biggest supplier to the European Union of natural gas. Liquid natural gas, as the president has talked about, the European Union has agreed with the administration to take as much liquid natural gas as we can get there. Is a possibility. You need terminals at each end, a terminal to freeze the gas, load the gas, and then you need a ship to take it to a terminal to unfreeze it and put it in a pipeline. So this is essential in what I would call the new Cold War and the new policy of containment, that a basic issue is to get more energy supplies to the European Union, specifically natural gas, so Russia does not have a chokehold on them.
Very good. And as we've discussed a little bit in the past, there are some facilities that could be built, especially in the Baltic states, that would help supply on that liquid natural gas. So thank you.
Yeah, Tom, there is a facility starting construction in Estonia, and the Norwegians can have the capacity to add natural gas. But here is where the United States has a big role. We are a supplier of natural gas to the European Union, but our bigger role would be supplier of liquid LNG gas.
Mm-hmm.
Takes time, but that would be our role.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that facility is near Tallinn, if I recall. Well, let me get back to Ambassador Barrett. He's on the ground. By the way, a former mayor of Milwaukee, former member of Congress, spent some time in the Wisconsin legislature, so brings a lot of experience to the job. Just recently, the EU foreign ministers met in Luxembourg and came up with that fifth sort of set of sanctions. As you mentioned earlier, I mean, Russia may be the biggest loser economically already around this, other than Ukraine itself, which is being pummeled and devastated. But what do you think those new sanctions are going to bring to the mix?
Well, first of all, I want to say, I think one of the biggest surprises for Putin was the speed and the incredible unanimity that came out of the European Union. I frankly think that it even surprised the European Union itself how quickly it responded. And I realize that we're bipartisan here or nonpartisan. I give a lot of credit to President Biden for this. And the reason I give credit for President Biden, and this, I've experienced this firsthand, and each of these gentlemen will know exactly what I'm talking about. You know, we receive a lot of information from the State Department. And what happened basically in January and February, leading up to the invasion, is President Biden in real time was providing the information that we had gathered to say what Putin's next move was going to be. And there were a lot of doubters who here in Europe were saying that we were overreacting, that our information was not good information. And as it turned out, in my experience, every bit of real-time information that we put out as a nation was correct. And I think that frustrated Putin, that we had such good information. And I honestly believe that enhanced our credibility with our European partners, because we brought so much to the table in terms of information. So I think that that's the first major point that has to be made here, is that we, along with our European allies, have been very effective. If there had been more naysayers in the European Union, or if there had been cracks in the coalition, I think that Putin was expecting that, quite honestly, and it hasn't happened. And I didn't know. Again, I'm new in this position. It all happens within 4 weeks of my arriving here. But I was very, very impressed up and down the line with the members of the European Union and beyond, and other countries as well, who have stepped up and said, no, this is not acceptable. This is barbaric. This is premeditated. We're going to act in unison. I think that was powerful. The SWIFT sanctions, the other sanctions that are going on the oligarchs right now here in Luxembourg, they're cracking down. They're cracking down in other countries. And I just saw another Russian billionaire today who was quoted as saying that this is insane. This is insane. What they are seeing out of Putin. So I think that they certainly are having an impact. And again, obviously, Ukraine has been the one that has suffered the most. The people in Ukraine have suffered the most. But I think that clearly this has had an economic impact on Russia. And I think the more we can just keeping our foot on the gas pedal with these sanctions, I think that that's very, very important.
You know, what many of our to Ukraine, but what its main contribution may be that its power as a financial center and what can be brought to bear on Russia.
Well, but it is, as you know, it's the second largest worldwide center or country for investment funds, behind only the United States. And as my wife said just on a walk earlier tonight, she said every big old beautiful building in this country, you walk past it, it's a bank or it's an investment center. There's a lot of money in this country. And so I think, and this is something that I didn't know what Luxembourg's reaction was going to be. And I talked to the finance minister, and they are so much on board with the European Union response. First of all, I was very, very pleased because there is Russian investment here. There's Chinese investment here. And that's been their strategy, is they want to have countries invest here. And they've been very, very successful. But I think here in Luxembourg, they recognize that they need the European Union. Without a doubt, Luxembourg recognizes how important the European Union is, and it wants to be totally in line with the European Union. And I'm obviously very pleased with that.
And so therefore, I mean, it sounds like Luxembourg is really in a almost unique position to help bring to bear these kinds of sanctions that, as you said earlier, may be hurting Russia as much as anybody, if not more.
Well, I know that they've done an analysis here of how much Russian investment there's, and obviously it's in the billions, but the amount of money in this country, it's a very small percentage of the amount of money here. But I will say the prime minister here is one of the few European unions to have several talks with Putin in the last month or so, where he has had conversations with him. Now, Luxembourg, again, a very small country. It took what many considered an unprecedented step, like many other European Union countries, in expelling a Russian diplomat. And that was a big deal. That was a big deal for them to do here, because they've got a small delegation, and they know ultimately it's going to come back to them. Russia's going to do the same thing to them. But that goes to show you the isolation you're seeing of Russia right now on the world stage, as country after country is expelling diplomats. And again, just saying, nope.
Yeah.
Tom Still?
Yes.
Yeah, it's Mark Mead. So I agree with what much of Tom Barrett has said, and I am impressed with the Biden administration's ability to rally NATO and Europe. I think it's been commendable and impressive. But let me also offer a few cautionary notes. If you take all of the countries that have imposed sanctions on Russia, that represents about 15% of the world's population. Most of Africa has not voted with us. Obviously, China has not voted with us. India has not voted with us, and voted with Russia, but they haven't voted with us. And so I think the toughest part of the work for not just the administration, but for the administration and our allies is lies ahead. Because unless we are able to indicate to countries like India and others that neutrality is not acceptable, or that being on the other side is certainly not acceptable, I think these costs are going to be hard to maintain, because again, you see fallout in a number of parts of the developing world where hunger is going to go up. So, we have work to do. We're according to General Milley, we're in the early part of this conflict. God, I hope that's not true, but it appears as though we may be. But we have work to do if we're going to expand this, because right now it's still a very small part of the world that is fully on board with us. The parts that are, it's impressive. I did not believe that NATO would come forward like this. And even today, Germany has indicated that they will, in fact, ban the import of Russian oil by the end of the year. And I'm not sure that's a step that anybody believed that they would take. Those are very good things. But I think there's a long way to go before we can say that this is, somehow bringing Putin to his knees. I think his calculations are probably different than ours.
Right. And I think many of the countries that you mentioned are either reliant on Russia for food, such as wheat, or arms in some cases, or oil and natural gas. And so I know, some are trying to set it out and be a little more neutral than not, but obviously there are some that,
it's impressive what we've done. It's just there's more to do.
Right. Let me get back to Ambassador Graber. So you served in the Czech Republic, which was kind of under the heel of the Soviet Union for 50
Not
years.
kind of, it was.
Yeah, it was. And before that, there's long memories about the invasion of the Germans, the Nazis, just before, really at the start of World War II. How do they view this? How do your contacts, enduring contacts in the Czech Republic, how do they view this now? And how is that seen in the rest of Eastern Europe? Are they being affected on the trade and economy a little more than most because of proximity?
Yeah, in preparation for this, Tom, I have talked to some former colleagues who are still at the United States Embassy. And indeed, the Czechs are seeing what a lot of the rest of the world is seeing, higher prices, particularly higher energy prices, higher food prices, very low unemployment right now. I think the great fear is what would happen if there's some sort of embargo on Russian energy coming into these countries, or even if there's a dramatic reduction in the amount of energy supplied. Look, I agree with Tom Barrett. It is very difficult for there ever to be unanimity in the European Union. You've got a lot of different countries with different languages and different histories and different cultures. It's just very hard to agree on anything. But I think the Europeans are seeing pretty clearly that this dependence on Russian energy is a mistake and really has them in a very tough spot right now. Czech Republic specific, they import about 86% of their gas from Russia, 35 to 50% of their oil. That's tough. And if all of a sudden you don't have that energy, you can't turn that around in a day. Tom Loftus is right. Norway could be a very great source for the Czechs and others. The United States could be a source. The Middle East could be a source, but that's not quick. So if there is some sort of slowdown or even embargo on energy coming into countries like the Czech Republic, it's a massive problem, which is inevitably going to cause pretty dramatic economic consequences. So a lot to worry about there for sure.
Mm-hmm. Right. That infrastructure would take time to build. I think the latest figure I saw was $800 million, 800 billion, I believe, a day on energy that flows, Russian imports into the EU.
Yes. And the reserves, the Czech reserves of oil and gas are not huge. Oil, about 90 days of reserve, gas, about a month, not very much time.
I think it's a problem throughout Europe. The reserves are.
I'm sure it is.
Yeah. And let's build on that a little bit because, in parts of Europe, let's take France. the nuclear energy industry remains really dominant. Germany backed off for a while. Some other nations did as well, but some are still thinking about that as one opportunity. Certainly other renewables, solar, wind. Again, these are infrastructure pieces that take a while to
Big
build.
time.
Some other comments on that from all of the ambassadors.
Well, I think Germany is
Tom-
facing that right now. Germany understands very much that it became too reliant on Russian oil, and was obviously made the decision to get rid of its nuclear capacity. But the speed with which it is able to move to renewables, I think, is the challenge. That, and the others have alluded to this. That's a real world challenge.
Mhm. Ambassador Loftus, what do you see there?
Well, I think we should all see the obvious, and that is that normal trade between Russia and the rest of the world almost, but especially Europe, that's gone. So you'll see new trade regimes, new trade routes. Finland and Sweden are seriously considering joining NATO. If they do it, they'll do it together. Both have a long history of distrust, dislike, and everything else with Russia. But you would have with Finland something like, I don't know how long the border is, a new border with NATO if Finland joined. At the moment, we have the Baltics, but and Norway is the only real NATO member with a Russian border where there's actual troops and submarines and guns and ships and missiles on the other side. So this would be a dramatic change, not only in the world order of security, but also in trade, because you would have to see Finland and Sweden really regenerate new trade patterns. For Sweden, that's a large industrial rich country. Finland is not, but they have been invaded by Russia, I don't know how many times. And they see this as an opportunity, and it could be really a change in how commerce and trade is conducted if those two join NATO.
Yeah, some observers, economists, historians, and others say this is the biggest globalization trade realignment since World War II, but previously 1914, when World War I broke out. Let me get to some specifics here. I think Ambassador Green mentioned this about on the ag side specifically. Heavy reliance on Ukrainian wheat, corn, Russia as well, cereals, barley, oil seeds, all kinds of agricultural products. That's a problem short term. Is it an opportunity for American agriculture in the longer term?
I guess I'll take a crack at that. Sure, I think it is. And when we say agriculture, we mean agriculture writ large. So broad-based other inputs in agriculture, I think it is, because Russia and Ukraine had been the source for so many of those inputs, chemicals and fertilizers in particular. So I think that is an opening for Wisconsin agribusiness. And I do agree with Tom Still, what you've just said and others have alluded to. Our economists are telling us that, it isn't quite clear how this realignment occurs, but you could see the world break into a couple of different broad lines. And that will present obviously complexities, challenges, but opportunities at the same time. So I think that's important. The other thing that it does, when you put this on top of COVID, it also forces business leaders and policymakers here in Washington to rethink how trade is done. So oftentimes trade and commerce moves to the lowest cost supplier. Well, maybe now it moves to a low cost supplier, but one that's reliable, one that's predictable, one that's sustainable, one that is not at risk security wise. So there's going to be a realignment there, the near shoring and friend shoring that so many have talked about. So that also creates opportunities. So for example, if you look at markets south of the US border, now, do they really want to be relying upon a far off country in Eastern Europe that is unsettled because of Putin's expansionist, aggressive, brutal tactics? Or would they rather move to an easy, reliable producer and partner in the US, even if it might not be the lowest cost? So all of this, I think, is creating new opportunities and will force us to think differently.
Very good. Thank you. And I'm going to pose this to everybody, but I want to start with Ambassador Barrett, again, on the ground in Luxembourg. Ukraine is really the leading producer of neon gas that's used with semiconductors to help power the lasers that are used to etch semiconductors. And it's in a way, it's kind of a byproduct of steel production, because neon's a inert gas and colorless and odorless, and there's not much of it here, even though it's all over the universe, but it's used in that way. And do you think that part of Putin's plan has been to disrupt that particular industry to a point that it hurts the West more than anyone?
Again, a lot of this is beyond the purview of my job as U.S. ambassador to speculate on this, but in terms of what Putin's motives were, I think Putin's motives were simply to reverse the historic trend that began in 1990. He referred to the breakup of the Soviet Union as the worst event of the 20th century. I think he's still bitterly angry about that. I think he's still bitterly angry that the countries that Tom Loftus referred to that moved towards the EU and moved towards NATO, he's angry. That's my perception. He's angry about that. And I think that drives him more than a calculation about a specific product and how it would hurt the United States or European countries. Again, I invite the others to weigh in there, but I think it's much more deep-seated than that.
Yeah,
I agree. I mean, Tom Barrett's got to be a little careful as a sitting ambassador. The rest of us don't.
okay.
Vladimir Putin is an evil man. He hates the West. I agree that, does he get into that level of detail in his thinking? I don't know, but he will do anything that hurts the West, including especially the United States. I think it's just worth mentioning that something much more than economic thinking is going on here with countries like the Czech Republic that I know pretty well. This is about freedom. So the Czech Prime Minister Fiala was one of the first to meet with Zelensky. They've sent tanks into Ukraine. They're really in many ways acting against their economic best interests, at least short term. Because there's this thought, there's this memory in the minds of every single Czech person, particularly people who remember the Soviet days, of what it means to not have freedom and liberty, and to appreciate more than ever the democracies that the Czechs have and that others in the region now have that didn't have during those Soviet bloc days. So this isn't a very emotional time. It's not just economics. It's the very core of who they are as a country. And I think that's going on all over Europe, but particularly in places like the Czech Republic and Slovakia and Hungary and Romania.
Without a doubt, in Eastern Europe, you see that. You clearly see it in Eastern Europe.
Yeah. And it's not, so you've got countries like countries in Europe that are embracing human liberty, human dignity, and democracy, things that they fought so hard for. But even in countries that may not have that tradition, it's sovereignty. So you've got countries that are pushing back on the whole notion that Putin wants to return us to diplomacy by conquest. Let's remember that the single most moving speech given at the United Nations about Putin's invasion didn't come from Ukraine. It didn't come from Europe. It came from the ambassador from Kenya. And Kenya said, look, we don't like how our borders were drawn. They were drawn by colonists. We didn't have any role in that. But guess what? They are our lines. We are a sovereign nation. We have come to terms with it. We don't expect anyone to come and change those lines. So I think even those who are not with us in terms of liberal democracies understand that the whole system falls apart if you can't rely on borders, if you can't rely on sovereignty, if you cannot rely on the stability of your partners. So it becomes something that works in many parts of the world. You know, we're told, and none of us knows for sure, that even the Chinese are a little bit worried about what they see, because if you start moving to this path of the instability of borders, that also causes problems for them. They have issues all around on their borders. So I do think there's a larger point that does create the opportunity for building a greater worldwide coalition against this brutal thug.
And Tom,
yes, Ambassador Loftus.
and you have some quite historical things going on here. Poland and Ukraine were never chummy. There's a long history there of antagonism between these two places. And then you see Poland step up without blinking an eye, without asking anything in return, in taking millions of refugees and just forgetting about the age-old differences. There's also some of this going on with Israel and Ukraine, that Israel sees a role for itself helping Ukraine, and there was not much of a very good history in Ukraine as regards the Jews either. And here we have a sovereign country with a Jewish president. It's amazing what's going on.
Tom, you're right. Poland is a key player in all this,
Yeah.
and really has done a great job stepping up.
Absolutely. And it gets back to what you said, Ambassador Graber, about sort of the special feelings within Eastern European countries, having been under Soviet dominance for so long. Let's get to some audience questions that kind of build on the conversation so far. Ambassador Green, you mentioned China, and someone was wondering, is China really watching this closely, the Western response to that, and then basically taking notes and thinking about Taiwan and the contested waters in the South China Sea? Is that going on behind the scenes?
Well, the gentleman who runs my Kissinger Institute said the important thing to understand about China is with every world occurrence, they listen, they learn, they take notes. So whether or not they draw a direct line, they're processing it, they're putting it into their calculations and their broad aspirations. Remember that China looks at the world very differently than many of us do. We tend to look for short-term immediate gratification. China's patient.
Mm-hmm.
China has plans that go on decades and centuries. So I think they process all of this, and I do think they look for ways to use it. It helps them to understand who their rivals are.
Others on that question about China taking notes.
Well, I think there's no question. I agree with Mark, and Xi Jinping is probably the strongest and most dangerous leader that country has had in recent memory. So very worried about that, and very worried about where Taiwan might fit into all this.
Very good. Let's build.
I think, Tom, that also that China sees something that perhaps was unexpected. NATO is arming Ukraine. So NATO has taken a role there, which, you know, no NATO country is threatened in the sense that Article 5 would be invoked. But because Ukraine is a sovereign country, there is no qualms, no problem with arming and training in that sense. And I think China might see a little bit of that as it regards to Taiwan.
And well, I think everyone has commented on the fact that the NATO alliance pulled together so quickly, and some some audience members are sort of asking, well, how did that happen so quickly? Because there were the experience in Afghanistan was fairly recent memory for some countries in NATO, but yet it happened. Ambassador Barrett, what are your
Again,
thoughts on the
I
speed of
point
it?
to I can tell you that my experience again was that people questioned the information that the United States was putting out there publicly for everyone. And at the same time they were questioning it, I think that they were analyzing it and they were listening to it. And that gave them time to prepare. But the speed with which it responded was astounding. And I think it completely took Putin by surprise, and the fact that it's held together. And I think you've gleaned from the comments of everyone that the energy issues are going to be challenges going forward, certainly for all of Europe. But if there is a way, and I think that's the big issue, if there's a way to resolve that, and that's not an easy issue to resolve, I think it's much, much easier for the European Union to stay together. I also think it feels the most threatened. And I think this gets to the issues that Mark Green was talking about in Africa or other parts of the world where they don't see it on their doorstep and they don't have the history in Europe. So it's not as direct a concern. I think it's still a direct concern here in Europe.
Yeah. Another question that arose, how much is enough when it comes to applying sanctions against Russia? Is there a danger in completely crippling the Russian economy? Ambassador Barrett, we can start with you on that or others.
I think that what you're seeing as long as these sanctions are effective, I think that you're going to see every country that's involved in it. And again, I agree with Mark Green that it is going to be important to get more countries involved in it. But it's been it's been an amazingly strong coalition. And I think back just to China briefly, I think that China, one of the things it's looking at is it's got a lot of trade here with Europe, and it's looking at that as well and analyzing that.
So Tom,
I would go ahead, Mark.
I was just going to say, the key to all of this will be the willingness, particularly in Europe, to take on the really tough choices and steps in energy. So, I think oil, a full-on oil embargo. We had Russia's former foreign minister said that if there were a complete and global oil embargo of Russian oil, Putin would be done in a month. Now, there is a very long way to go because there's still lots of self-interest there. Natural gas is even tougher for Europe. Oil's a little bit easier, but these are real difficult choices that European leaders will have to make, and I think creates important tasks and challenges for the Biden administration. And I mean it in a positive way. I think there are many things to like about what the administration has accomplished in the alliance, but I do think that there's a lot of tough work to go. Final point to this, we have to ask ourselves, does each country look at success here the same way? So what is acceptable, an acceptable outcome to Zelensky, to President Biden, to Germany? It may not all be the same. And so I think that's the other question that's going to be key here, because as time goes on and you do feel the economic pain, that may create some strains in the alliance, because I'm not sure that we look at all of it the same way. Does Putin have to leave all the territories that he's occupied from 2014 to date? Those were Ukrainian territories. I think that's a real challenge that everyone will have to grapple with in coming months.
Look, you can't appease this guy. Sorry, Tom Loftus, I'll be real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
You can't appease Vladimir Putin. We've seen American presidents of both parties try to do that, and it never works. I saw firsthand in the Czech Republic where George Bush was trying to put a missile defense system into that country and into Poland to protect against Iranian rockets. And I saw the fury that Vladimir Putin and his thugs unleashed in the Czech Republic in terms of a very effective campaign that put an end to that project. That's who this guy is. And so I would be in favor of ratcheting up those sanctions tougher than they are right now, cut off his energy revenue, and ultimately bring an end to this guy and his rule over Russia, what was the Soviet Union. It's this is not the Russian people. This is Vladimir Putin, and he's a bad guy that at some point has to go.
Yeah. And so in other words, in terms of the sanctions and other ways of applying pressure, there's no such thing in your mind as too much. I mean,
No.
it just has to keep going.
Well, and Tom, I agree with Rick. I mean, these sanctions are there, and they are the new containment strategy. They're not going to go away. We also have to talk about something that's little noticed, and that is Putin's sanction on himself, in the sense that they have spent the treasury, especially the defense budget, in the last 20 years on nuclear submarines, on missiles, on all kinds of things that have bled the other part of his military to the point where the incompetence that you see here. It also points out the uselessness of all of the nuclear weapons that he has, which are designed to blow up the United States. So he has trapped himself into commitment to funding some very, very expensive weapons systems that are directed at the United States that prove to be useless in the war in Ukraine.
Indeed. One quick last question from an audience member. Then I want to get to you for your thoughts, and especially with Ambassador Barrett, the closing words on this. Once nations engage in these new partnerships from trade, and there was talk about the realignment of different trade routes and channels and everything as the economy moves through this, how willing do you think some of the folks in the EU will be willing to re-engage with Russia, if at all, in terms of trade? Has this poisoned the well for most of those countries for a generation?
It may be a generation. I think, again, there's still more that has to be resolved here. It's going to be dependent upon how long this continues, how devastating it is. And I want to go back to your initial question about the trade impacts in Wisconsin and other places. And as I said then, Russia's been the big loser when it comes to that. And I think, again, Ambassador Green alluded to this, we can't lose sight of, as much as Russia's been a loser, the real people who are suffering are Ukrainians, and they're losing their lives. I've talked to several business people here who have done business in Ukraine and have lost employees, who's lost their lives, or his families have been totally disrupted with the families leaving. The human suffering is enormous. It is enormous in Ukraine. And so because it's such human suffering, we don't even focus on the economic devastation that's going on there. And I think that's going to be part of the calculus as to how soon countries can move past this, assuming that there is some good ending. I mean, we still have to have a good ending. If there's not a good ending, then who knows what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Very good. We've only got about 4 minutes left. I want to go around the horn and just anything that we haven't touched on that you'd like to raise, or something that you raised previously that you really want to emphasize. I'm going to start with Ambassador Graber here.
I would just reinforce some of the points I've already made. To me, the best course of action going forward, and there's no perfect course of action by any means. It's not clear exactly what the right answers are, but I would ratchet up sanctions. I would unleash American energy, and I would make sure that the United States, NATO, and the allies are supplying the Ukrainians absolutely everything they need in terms of military equipment.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Ambassador Green.
Well, I agree with everything that Rick has said about our approach to Putin. But I think it's really important for us to all realize what the consequences are in third countries and third places, and they're significant. We are now over 100 million refugees and internally displaced people around the world. And this is going to continue that cost burden. We're seeing more and more money being shifted to humanitarian assistance from economic development, from the kinds of investments that support trade. So the long-term consequences of this, of what Putin has done and unleashed, are profound and will set back much of the developing world quite some years.
Not encouraging to hear, but certainly true. Thank you, Ambassador Green. Ambassador Loftus.
Well, I endorse the comments and agree with them. And I will have to say that it's very good to see Ambassador Tom Barrett in his office with the flag behind him, representing the United States in the heart of the European Union. You go, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
Here, here.
And
We all agree with that.
Yes, and I'll say, to sort of bring this home, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was invited to the Belgian ambassador's residence for lunch with my wife, and it's a 15-minute ride. And we got in the car, and all of a sudden it turned into a 50-minute ride, 50. And the traffic was horrible in this small country of Luxembourg. And I was frankly, I was angry with my driver, thinking, how can you turn this 15-minute ride into a 50-minute ride? But I'm a diplomat now, so I didn't yell at him. But when I got to the lunch, and I was embarrassed with my wife and apologized to the Belgian ambassador and his wife. And about 25 minutes later, he said, well, you know why you were late, don't you? I said, I don't know why I was late. And he said they were doing construction work near the train station here in Luxembourg City, and they uncovered a World War II bomb. And so they had to reroute all the traffic, and they had to, obviously, everything was bollocksed up. I tell you that story because I think in America, we don't think about that. We don't think about the history 70, 80 years ago of the devastation that took place in Europe. Europeans remember that. And back to your question as to why are they so unified? I think it's because they remember that. And they saw what happened when one person took everything into his own hands because of his personal ambitions. And we can't forget that. We can't forget what the history was. And we have to do everything we can, I think, to achieve peace and to help all the people in Ukraine who are suffering right now.
Very good. Thank you. And you're so correct. Long memories in Europe, especially when they see this latest unprovoked invasion. Well, I want to thank all of the ambassadors for joining us today. You know, it speaks well for Wisconsin's position on the world stage that we've been able to have people like yourselves, either currently or in the past, representing the United States and the state of Wisconsin, as you really worked in different settings in different countries. So thanks as well to WIS Business and WIS Politics, Jeff Mayers and team for organizing this, to Sarah from Michael Best and all of our other sponsors. You can see here on the screen the rest of those who helped make this possible. And again, this is part of a year-long sort of series that we're doing in collaboration with WIS Business and WIS Politics and the Wisconsin Technology Council to bring these kinds of issues to bear so that you can hear and learn more as you are here in Wisconsin. So thanks again, Ambassador Barrett. Best of luck on your new job as you move ahead. Ambassador Green, especially with your role at the Wilson Center, Ambassador Graver with the Bradley Foundation and its continued work on the economy and everything else that's going on. And to Ambassador Loftus, who continues to be a force in parts of the world that he's been able to touch in the past. Again, thank you all, and we'll see you soon.